We'll explore the atomic bombs, but also go into August Storm, the Soviet invasion into Manchuria. To chair our session is Dr. Michael Bell. Mike is the executive director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, which is responsible for putting this program together with all of our partners. Mike is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, served over 3 decades in service to our country. He was a tanker. He was in the armor, so that's why he's got his hearing aids, but he can yell real loud when he needs to. Mike served as Dean of Faculty and Academic Programs at the National War College and Chancellor of the National Defense University. He worked on the National Security Council before we were fortunate enough to get him here to run our higher education, lifelong learning, academic initiatives, all the great stuff that we do at the Institute. And every now and then I let him put his historian hat on, and so he's going to chair this session. And he's going to do a great job of it with the 2 Johns that we have with us. Dr. Bell, the panel is yours.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. Thanks for everything you've done behind the scenes to make this a reality. Thanks to everybody who's here. Thanks for your engagement. Rich last night mentioned General Petraeus, and I was thinking of this panel. There's a comment that Dave Petraeus makes to Rick Atkinson in 2003 up in Mosul. Tell me how this ends. And what we, only in retrospect do we know how these wars end. And so what we're going to unpack in this panel, August Storms, the atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, is something that we can only understand in retrospect. What are those combination of factors that'll shock the system enough so that happens. So, last night we heard from Rich that Emperor Hirohito had commented on 8 August, the day before Nagasaki, quote, "The war must end right now." But certainly the members of Hirohito's cabinet hadn't quite made that mental transition yet. And, what conclusions do they have? Some suspected there's only one American bomb. This isn't an arsenal, as Truman announces in his address to the American people. Oh, it's just one. And so we can ride this out. We can still inflict these casualties that'll make the Americans quit and go home. The allure of that. Perhaps we'll keep the Soviets out of the war. The non-aggression pact will hold. In the meantime, the Americans will drop the demand for unconditional surrender. Ultimately, on the 8th of August, the Soviet Union will declare war. The 9th of August, arguably, is a shock to the system. Nagasaki and the Soviet intervention into Manchuria. So for this panel, we're going to explore some of that. In the earlier panel, we kind of did the build-up. First it's the big build-up. Now, last panel was the near-range build-up, and now this is the immediate shocks that will, ultimately produce the announcement that they'll accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. Notice they never do actually say that they will surrender. They don't actually want to use those words. And the surrender will still be weeks away on the 2nd of September. Now for this panel, some more amazing historians, scholars, practitioners, and I think we're in for a treat. So we have Dr. John Curatola. He's the Museum Samuel Murray Stone Senior Historian, retired Marine officer. He certainly will never let us forget that. But he's one of those interesting ones because he was a retired Marine who loves the Air Force, who taught at the Army. And so he's like the ultimate joint practitioner as we think through this. Now, his first 2 books are on early nuclear capabilities, early Cold War, the bomb. The first one, I love the title, Bigger Bombs for a Brighter Tomorrow. So who better to talk about, kind of atomic warfare. But I should give a shout out, his most recent book, Armies Afloat, is the development of amphibious capability in the European theater and how that happened, something they didn't imagine overnight. And of course, not deterred, he's working on a biography of Curtis LeMay, now as well. So some amazing insights. I think with John, the problem is we're only going to have to condense it into the time here. And so maybe on the breaks or others, you can ambush him and get some more. And then we have another icon in the field, Dr. Jonathan House.
Outstanding in the field in the rain.
I'm not sure what that was, but okay. Now, Jonathan's Professor Emeritus of Military History at the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College. Entered the Army in the mid-'70s, of course, with a doctorate in history already. Not something you normally do as a second lieutenant in armor. I know I had a senior officer put his arm around me when I was in the Pentagon and told me to take my PhD off my official record. So I imagine they certainly
It didn't help, no.
They certainly didn't celebrate it. But an Intel expert has some amazing work on military history of the Cold War, military history of the New World Disorder, 1989 to 2022. Sounds kind of familiar. Intelligence of the state. You've probably seen his work with David Glantz when Titans clashed on the Nazi-Soviet war or Stalingrad. Of course, I remember him back in the day. He was already an icon when I was at Leavenworth in the 90s. As a captain, he wrote Toward Combined Arms Warfare in the huge transition of air-land battle in that piece. And so I think we have some amazing scholar practitioners that have insights that have come from those careers, experiences, their studies along the way. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, not Jonathan, and we'll continue the attack. Over to you.
Do it.
Thanks, boss. Good job. First thing I'd like to say is I'd like to thank the great John Parshall for introducing my paper now that I'm going to be talking about from this morning. So thank you, sir, for your great efforts. Now, it is a little intimidating to have to follow up with that great panel that we had just before lunch, and it's one of the reasons why I like working at this museum, because you get to work with the top scholars in the field. And I think you can all appreciate what you saw earlier this morning. It was absolutely outstanding. So today I'm going to talk about what I refer to as the non-decision. That's how I look at the atomic delivery piece here, is that there really isn't a decision made. And I'm going to explain to you why I think that is. And you can disagree with me later on if you would like. So what I'm going to do is talk about the synergy of factors that are involved with this weapon and its, of course, subsequent use that we all know. And I'm going to talk to you from a standpoint of July/August of 1945. What do you know at the time? Think of Teddy Roosevelt's The Man in the Arena. You're dirty, you're tired, you're scarred, but you got to make a decision with the information that you have at the time. The great historian Sam Walker has a vignette in his book Prompt and Utter Discussion where he talks about Truman sitting with the chiefs of staff, discussing the numbers for what the invasion will look like. And Truman says, okay, we'll use the atomic bomb. And then he says, that meeting never happened. And he's right. It doesn't happen. It's a cacophony of decisions that are made over time from all kinds of factors. My good friend Jane Scott talked a little bit about this morning. Operation Meeting House and the firebombing of Japan. We start firebombing way before March 9 and 10, 1945, folks. We're doing this stuff in Europe. This idea of daylight precision bombardment, yeah, it really kind of doesn't work. And what you see by 1944, 1945 is the U.S. Army Air Corps kind of following in line with our RAF counterparts, doing area bombardment. We won't admit it. We will speak with forked tongue. We will actually use the term a precision area raid. I have no idea what that means, but that's what they call it, a precision area raid. And so we start firebombing these cities, as James talked about, not only because of weather, But another problem you have here is the B-29 itself, as we talked about this morning, biggest, most expensive, technologically advanced bomber at the time. It's also got a lot of problems. There's an old Air Force axiom, never fly the A model of anything. This is the A model, okay? And it's got lots of problems. So on top of the weather that James had talked about, it's got all kinds of technical maladies that helps LeMay push those altitudes down to between 7,000 and 10,000 feet. Matter of fact, to quote LeMay, he said the B-29 had more bugs in it than the entomological department at the Smithsonian. Plus, as James also pointed out, it's the single biggest expense of the Second World War for the United States. Cost you more than $3 billion. Manhattan cost you $2 billion, okay? And if you're working for Hap Arnold, and LeMay is, he's basically told, this thing's gonna work. You understand me? It's gonna work. And so put those pressures, the weather, the fact that the B-29 has Arnold's professional and personal reputation online for this thing, calls for some pragmatism. And of course, we know about the firebombing. And so what you're seeing here already is an acceptance on the part of the Army Air Forces and largely the American people of mass destruction. We started with precision. Americans don't kill people per se, we kill things. But by 1945, it's too difficult. So you already have an acceptance of area bombardment. You already have an acceptance of using mass and destroying whole cities as a result of the fire raids. So you're already kind of conditioned to these ideas. Let's give you some numbers to take a look at regarding Japanese urban infrastructure. And again, James talked about this, knocking out 103 square miles of Japanese infrastructure in the short span of a few months. So again, people are kind of already used to mass destruction from the air. This is largely accepted. As a matter of fact, LeMay gets fan mail by the sackload, to include one letter which I read, where he says, from an Army chaplain, you're really giving those Japs hell. Keep up the good work. Okay. That's the kind of sentiment that's going on at this time. And to kind of transition into that, you think about the way the American people were thinking at this time. This word called enmity, hate, visceral reactions regarding the Japanese themselves. And you can see some of the numbers that I've put up here regarding how the Americans felt about the Japanese. And make no mistake, folks, the Pacific War is a race war at its core in that time. We hate them, they hate us. They refer to us as, this is a quote, I'm a historian, I'm just giving you a quote, big-nosed, smelly barbarians who allow their wives to get educations and talk too much, unquote. I did not say that, they said that. And of course, we're all aware of the iconographic pictures of Japanese as lice or vermin or snakes and those kinds of things. So you already have this kind of racial enmity existing in the Pacific War that you didn't necessarily see in the European War. There is a distinction between good Germans and bad Germans. All Japanese are bad. All Japanese are bad. So again, put this kind of visceral human reaction into this mix regarding how we feel about the Japanese as a people. Also, in the spring of 1945, the Japanese will articulate their intent regarding this war itself. Now remember, you don't know about the atomic bomb, you don't know what's going on, but you're getting these messages from Japan that they will prosecute the war in order to accomplish its ends. They're going to mobilize the national polity, April 13th, 1945, with the National Volunteer Combat Force, with all males between 15 and 16 and women between 17 and 40. And then in June, they're going to do another Volunteer Services Act, and they're going to mobilize about 28 million people. Again, these are the things, the messages that you are receiving in the early summer, spring of 1945. And at the same time, and again, we talked about this morning, we know the Japanese are moving some troops from the mainland to the islands, not a lot, but we can tell through the intel intercepts that they're gearing up. And as we learned last night, there are many more troops sitting in Kyushu than we had expected. So again, if you're a military planner, this is what you're seeing. These are the observations you are making at the time. And of course, when the Potsdam Declaration comes out, and everyone in this room is pretty familiar with what it says, that you're going to have prompt and utter destruction unless you accept our terms. And the Japanese responds with a term called mokusatsu, of which I've given you a number of interpretations of that meaning, which ignore, treat with silent contempt, take no notice of, maintain silence. How does one interpret that if you're in the United States military? That they're not going to accept it. Whether or not they were going to think about it, the interpretation is, you just told us we're not doing it. Also, when we talked about the bombing of the Japanese cities, and as James mentioned, there's a cover of Time magazine that's got Kurt LeMay on it with his characteristical cigar and these B-29s flying, and it says, "Can Japan stand the pounding that Germany got?" And the Japanese response is, and I quote, "We're made of sterner stuff." So again, these are the messages that you're getting. And of course, the Japanese Prime Minister, as we learned last night, is part of the peace camp, but his public pronouncements don't necessarily reflect that. And the fact that we're going to continue to the successful conclusion of this war. Again, these are the messages you're getting from the Japanese at the time. Something else, we all know that FDR passes, Truman rises to the presidency at this time, and he says, and I quote right here, "I'm going to follow Roosevelt's policies as much as possible." To that end, he actually puts a photograph of Roosevelt in the Oval Office to remind him of that. Something else I'm going to point out to you in this picture that's really interesting. Look at the mantle on the fireplace. In the Truman Oval Office, all the ships that were in there under FDR are gone, and they're replaced with airplane pictures. Kind of shows you who's taken over a little bit here with regard to national security and those kinds of things. But more to this point, Harry Truman will also reflect in his own comments. Will help. At a joint session of Congress, our vision of our departed commander-in-chief will remain unchanged, unhampered. And on that June 18th meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he says he cannot change public opinion with regard to the unconditional surrender mandate. And he's advised by Secretary of State Burns that anything less than unconditional surrender looks too much like an appeasement of Japan. So again, you're looking at this from a policy standpoint from the president. He feels as if he has no other choice regarding unconditional surrender. Now, at the same time, when Truman comes to power, he gets read in on the atomic bomb, as we all know, and they put together a committee called the Interim Committee. And these are some gentlemen who are there to kind of help advise him on this new technology and what it means once he's read in on it. And the official reports from the Interim Committee say, and I highlighted the pertinent parts for you, that the bomb should be used against Japan as soon as possible, and it should be used without prior warning. At the same time, there's a scientific committee that is also part of the Interim Committee, which is made of Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, Arthur Compton, Ernst Lorst, and they will also report, as I show you right here, that we should also use this bomb as well. I'd like to note for everybody here that the scientists at Los Alamos are not hand-wringing at all. There are other scientists who are. Of course, they will publish what's called the Frank Report in June of '45 that says, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this. But if you read all of the interviews with the major scientists who are there at Los Alamos, none of them have these pangs of guilt in the summer of 1945 over what they were building. Matter of fact, one of them says, if I go to hell, it's going to be for something else. It's not going to be for this. Okay? Now, we also talked about that June 18th meeting at the earlier session as well. And these numbers that you see up here are actually presented to Harry. And we all know that he gets a couple of different responses Marshall, of course, says, hey, the results are so diverse, I can't give you a number. Leahy says it's about 35% of the landing force that's going to land because he's looking at some of the ratios that are here. There's a Joint War Plans Committee that puts together a statistic, and it says you're going to have about 132,000 casualties for Kyushu, which about 25,000 will be killed in action. It's a ratio of 1 to 4. And then for Honshu, it'll be about 87,000, of which 2,100 will be, or 25,000 will be killed in action. So it doesn't matter what number Harry gets. He knows it's a high number, regardless of the ratio, regardless of the intel. And keep in mind, what did Harry do in the First World War? He's an artillery officer. He's seen war firsthand. He does not need a reminder of the horrors of it. So you are getting this kind of information. Think about the strategic messages that are coming your way. Think about the acceptance of firebombing as we know it already, what the interim committee is telling you, and let's look at the domestic concerns. Get this war over with as soon as possible. VE Day has happened, right? People want to demobilization, but the problem is I have this fight in Japan, and we talked about numbers this morning, trying to get your cards to go home, and if you have 3 kids, hey, you're a lucky guy. But this idea of demobilization after D-Day is a problem. And you can see here there's a lack of manpower in home services, miners, fuel oil shortages. People want to return back to a peacetime environment. So there is a need to get this war over with as fast as possible to return to peace. You can see here Congressman Edwin Johnson talks about the summer demobilization process as being blind, criminal, and stupid. So think about the domestic pressure that's on Harry at this time as well, to get this war over with as soon as possible. And, as Sam Walker says, validate the expense. You spent $2 billion on this thing. Now, we don't have to think about that in terms of the strategic calculus, but there's something to that, and I'll talk about it here in a second. So here's why I say it's a non-decision. I already told you we set a precedent with regard to firebombing and area bombardment. We're already doing that. What is the difference between a fission ignition sequence or a conventional ignition sequence? The difference really is 1 aircraft, 1 plane, as opposed to 300 aircrafts dropping 10 tons of bombs. But the effect is still basically the same. National enmity, we hate them, they hate us. FDR's legacy on top of it. Organizational momentum. Think about what the interim committee is telling you. We already built this thing. We need to use this thing. And as I said, the scientists in Los Alamos pretty much figured this is going to be used. That's why we're building it. The casualty costs and projections that he gets, while they kind of are all over the place, he knows this will be a high figure. And the speed and the domestic concerns. But there's one up here that I didn't put down because I cannot prove it, but I think it is part of the equation. You don't drop this bomb, Harry, and you have to invade Kyushu and then maybe Honshu. And the American press, the public finds out you had a silver bullet in 1945 and you didn't drop it. You have a lot of constituents, a lot of widows, a lot of orphan children you have to answer to because you didn't utilize a weapon you had at a time of a national emergency. Again, I cannot prove that, but I have to think that as part of Harry's calculation, along with all of these other calculations that are going on in the summer of 1945. And I got one more slide I'm going to show you just as I was doing some research for my dissertation. I found this letter from Harry Truman to Dean Acheson. And this is his comment when Oppenheimer visited him. Here's attached as a crybaby scientist. I wished you to read and discuss with him. He came in here wringing his hands, telling me that he had blood all over them because of the discovery of atomic energy. Supposedly, Harry's response was, "Here's my handkerchief." So with that concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Sorry. I have lots of handicaps, not least having done too many sit-ups in my time. We won't even mention the 6% of my hearing I lost becoming a tanker officer. But anyhow, I'd like to talk to you this afternoon about this campaign that's been alluded to, but tends to get forgotten sort of sometimes. I was very glad that Richard Frank brought it up yesterday. Just after midnight on August 9th, 1945, the Soviet Union invaded Japanese-held Manchuria, overrunning the entire territory, as well as several Kuril Islands in 2 weeks. In conjunction with all the other factors you've heard, this must have had some effect, but I can't quantify it, on the Japanese decision to surrender. This operation that marks the end of two things that I want to talk about very briefly before I get to the campaign itself. And then I want to give you a flavor for the campaign as much as I can. The first of these preceding developments is the end of 40 years of Russian-Japanese military confrontations. And the second is what I call the graduation exercise of the Red Army, that it had, fighting against Germany, it had developed a very sophisticated technique of mechanized warfare, and this is its sort of chance to test it all out. Beginning with the history, if you will, in 1904-05, Russian forces operating at the end of a very long supply chain, something like 6 time zones, across Siberia, suffered repeated defeats at the hands of the newly developed Japanese Army and Navy. Those humiliations culminated in the naval battle of Tsushima Straits and the land battles around the rail junction of Mukden in central Manchuria. By the Treaty of Portsmouth, Japan assumed control of southern Manchuria, the Korean Peninsula, and the southern half of the island of Sakhalin, territory that Russia had previously considered its own. An armed truce ensued in northeastern Asia. During the Russian Civil War, in August of 1918, the Allied powers from the European War occupied Siberia, with Japan sending 72,000 troops, by far the largest contingent. Even after the rest of the Allies evacuated Russian territory in March of 1920, Tokyo supported the puppet Russian Republic for another 2.5 years. Periodic armed clashes in Northeast Asia succeeded. I don't want to talk about them except to say that frequently the Red Army was rather clumsy in battle. The one exception is that last line down there, occurring on the last 12 days of August 1939. The Japanese Guandong Army challenged the Soviets along the Khalkhin-Gol River just inside Soviet-dominated Outer Mongolia. They apparently believed that it was too difficult, too remote for the Russians to supply a counterattack force. But instead, Marshal Georgy Zhukov concentrated and supplied more than 800 armored vehicles, 679 artillery tubes, and 500 aircraft. He conducted a classic double envelopment, destroying 2 Japanese divisions. And the resulting Soviet victory catapulted Zhukov into leadership against the Germans the next year, while it also obviously deterred Japan from ever getting in a confrontation again. Instead, the Japanese turned south into French Indochina and eventually American Philippines and Dutch East Indies. The doctrine that Zhukov employed at Khalkhin-Gol had developed during the 1920s and early 1930s, known as deep operations, glubokaya operatsiya. The doctrine fell into disrepute after its authors were associated with the purges of the 1930s, but the concepts involved were fleshed out and developed during the Great Patriotic War against Germany. Although the Soviets learned some techniques from the Germans, it would be really oversimplified to describe deep battle as some kind of imitation blitzkrieg. Beginning with the encirclement of Stalingrad in November of '42, the Red Army developed the staff procedures and tactics to implement the deep operations concept. After extensive reconnaissance, the attacking Soviets usually tried to infiltrate and seize the first line of enemy defenses before the main attack. Combined arms assault groups would then try to bypass and eliminate the Axis strong points, disrupting the enemy defense. Once that penetration was achieved, the exploitation fell to what are called tank armies, but as you can see, they're much smaller than we would think of an army being. Spearheading the advance of each mechanized formation were forward detachments, which you're going to see again in a few minutes. Task-organized forces commanded by young men who, despite your stereotype of the Red Army, had great flexibility and initiative. Resupplied by hundreds of Lend-Lease trucks, the forward detachments operated in a manner similar to German Kampfgruppen, bypassing centers of resistance to penetrate as far as possible, then seize a bridgehead over the next river and prepare to do it again. The crisis of 1941 forced the USSR to withdraw substantial troops from Siberia for use against the Germans. Similarly, as you already heard, during 1944-45, the Japanese army had redeployed 21 of its most capable divisions away from Manchuria to oppose American advances in the Philippines and elsewhere. The two sides remained suspicious of each other even before April 5th, 1945, when the Soviet Union gave Tokyo the required one-year notice to cancel their existing non-aggression pact. On July 26th, as somebody's already briefed you this morning, the Allied Potsdam Declaration calling on Tokyo to surrender convinced Stalin that the United States intended to exclude the USSR from Japan. That same day, by coincidence, Japanese General Staff Intelligence got around to reporting that there were 1.3 million Red troops in eastern Siberia. But Japanese intelligence did not expect that Moscow would be able to attack before the fall of 45 or even the spring of 46. During the war, Stalin had repeatedly promised to attack Japan once Germany had been defeated. In the fall of 1944, the Soviet General Staff presented to the U.S. a long shopping list of Lend-Lease weapons and supplies necessary for that attack. I should note that even though President Truman halted Lend-Lease supplies in Europe on May 10th, the U.S. continued to ship all this aid to across the Pacific before Soviet entry. They obviously thought that Soviet entry into the Pacific War was important to reduce American casualties and speed the Japanese surrender. Two quick points I should make about this list. First of all, we all know how reliable and fantastic overall a Sherman tank is. That's a Sherman tank operated by the Red Army, by the way. But I note here that in terms of ground pressure, the per square inch pressure of its treads is about double that of your typical Soviet or German tank of the same era, and that turns out to be a problem when they get into swampy terrain. The last point there, you see all those warships. Those are necessary, at least in the Russian eyes, because they first want to leapfrog down the Japanese-held eastern coast of Asia and then try to take the islands, which I'll get to at the very end. This massive American aid was essential to circumvent the limitations that I mentioned before of the Trans-Siberian Railway. Now all that the Soviets had to send were troops with their individual weapons and certain specific pieces of equipment. Even that took 160,000 rail cars over months. However, Japanese intelligence data for some reason did not connect the shipments coming from the United States, as they had been for several years, with the troops coming eastward. Stalin had originally intended to begin his attack about August 15th, but the news of the Hiroshima atomic bombing galvanized him into action, determined to share in the spoils of Japan, and that, as we've already suggested, prompted an acceleration of the Soviet offensive to begin on the same day as the second bomb. Very quickly, in terms of the terrain, Northeast Asia is some of the most inhospitable territory in the world. If you look at it, those two white blobs there, which are outer and inner Mongolia, are a sparsely settled rocky plateau and almost desert. Most of Manchuria proper can be described as two mountain ranges running generally from southwest to northeast. The Greater Hingan Mountains in the north, the Eastern Highlands in the south, and in between them is the central plain of Manchuria, which is where all the water and all the road and rail transportation is. All right, who are the Soviets up against? The Guangdong Army, as I mentioned, has released many of its best units to defend the Philippines and other areas, but it remained a significant force in 1945. If it's not clear from this laundry list, there's three different elements here. First is the Guangdong Army itself, the Japanese army in Northeast Asia. Second are the Mongolian puppet troops, mostly horsemen in Outer Mongolia. And finally, the puppet soldiers of Manchuria, which is what that picture is I found. If you don't remember, or if it escaped your memory at the moment, Manchuria is a puppet empire that the Japanese had set up under the last heir to the Chinese throne. That's the Japanese side. The Soviet side is headed by Marshal Alexander Vasilyevsky, head of the Far Eastern Command. He'd been chief of staff of the Red Army for most of the war. And for the conquest of Mongolia and Manchuria, Vasilyevsky basically controls three major subordinate headquarters. The Soviets called these fronts. We would call them an army group, that is, a group of armies. The Transbaikal Front attacking from the west, the First Far Eastern Front attacking from the east, and the Second Far Eastern Front attacking from the north, and also the islands. So I had to talk about them in that order. You will notice 6th Guards Tank Army. That's the main exploitation force I mentioned before. It has been plussed up, in this case, to 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. And in essence, it's an organized live-fire test of what became the Red Army's organization after World War II. If you're wondering what the heck all those names mean, the second bullet down there gives you a rough idea of what each combined arms army contains, just by way of outline. Let's start in the west with the Transbaikal Front. It is stretched out, as you can see, trying to cross this very difficult terrain. During the night of August 8th to 9th, the Red Army dispatched assault troops to take out the border guards that were at the various main routes. Once over the border, the invaders are opposed more by the physical situation itself than by the Japanese defenders. Not only is it really terrible terrain, as I mentioned before, burns up a lot of gasoline trying to get through the mountains and swamps, but also there's a lot of heat exhaustion, because remember, this is August in a desert environment. Begin with the major group to the west. I hear you asking, what in the name of heaven is a cavalry mechanized group? Just what it sounds like, a combination of horse cavalry with tanks and light trucks, commanded by Colonel General Pliev, who, as a footnote, I might point out, turned out to be the commander of the Russian forces during the Cuban Missile Crisis many years later. Led by 2 brigade-sized forward detachments, the group advanced southwesterly in the direction of Beijing, which is off this map. The 17th Army, next to the east, if you will, covered 43 miles the first day, and that advance was doubled by Kravchenko's 6th Guards Tank Army that actually covered 93 miles from their starting points, getting into the foothills of the Hingan Mountains in one day. In a daring move, Soviet infantry transported on Lend-Lease C-47 aircraft air-landed on the Japanese airfields in Mukden on August 19th, and then linked up with the 2 advancing forces. Those spearheads swept aside most of the horse cavalry they encountered, but farther north, the 39th and the 36th Armies you see there, they ran into a very carefully developed Japanese defensive sector, and it took them 8 days to fight their way through it. Turn then, if we will, to the next front, because I just want to give you an overview here. On the other front of Manchuria, we have the First Far Eastern Front, commanded by Marshal Kirill Meritskov, a veteran of the Civil War, the Finnish conflict, and various campaigns against Germany. Here, as elsewhere, infiltration units secured Japanese outposts in advance of the main attack and then made a general overall advance. The Red Fifth Army advanced with 3 corps abreast. By the afternoon of the first day, they had penetrated the Japanese defenses of the border and begun the exploitation, with each tank corps sending out a tank brigade forward detachment. And they advanced 75 miles westward very quickly to the fortified town of Moutonxiang, where the Japanese 126th Infantry Division had assembled to block the advance. Mutonshiang was a major railroad and roll network as well as the headquarters. The defenders had constructed a series of fortifications on the high ground east of the town, but they didn't really have time to organize themselves because the Soviets arrived so quickly. General overall, you see those two blue arrows, 257th Tank Brigade reinforced coming in from the northeast, 76th Tank Brigade reinforced advancing due west. The Japanese did what they could to halt them. At one point, in fact, the 76 was down to only 7 functioning tanks because the Japanese, unsurprisingly, I guess we would think, used suicide attacks using explosives to try to disable them. But overall, they really couldn't stop them, and the Japanese ultimately failed. They just inflicted a bunch more casualties. The unexpected resistance of the Soviets encountered in Mutonshiang prompted Maritzkov to shift his focus away and south of the city. And that is the point where I think one of our speakers brought it up already. The United States became very concerned that the Red Army was about to overrun all of eastern China and the Korean Peninsula. So Dean Rusk hastily proposed, and Stalin agreed, to a temporary, quote unquote, division of the Korean Peninsula along the 36th parallel. In September of 45, the U.S. 24th Corps landed on the southern half of the peninsula. Each side brought with it its own exiled Cuban leaders. Similarly, on September 30th, the U.S. Marine 3 Amphibious Corps began moving into the area that is now Beijing, which is just below this map, if you will. Okay, finally come to the islands, because I want to move as quickly as I can. Joseph Stalin wanted to control parts of the Japanese island chain to recover formerly Russian territories and to have what he considered an equal role in the occupation. He planned to invade Hokkaido, the northernmost of Japan's main islands, in September, but in preparation for this, he had to make a number of preliminary attacks. First, 56th Rifle Corps attacked on the afternoon of 10 August, southward from the center of Sakhalin Island. They ground forward for about 8 days, and then the Red Army launched an amphibious landing, as you can see those 2 red arrows at the bottom, against the town of Maoka on the southwestern coast of the island. The 113th Rifle Brigade forced its way ashore despite the loss of 5 landing craft. The troops, fearful of suicide attacks, opened fire on civilian crowds waiting for evacuation from the area. The 113th then reboarded its shipping to sail around the southern tip of Sakhalin, that's what that red looping arrow indicates, and eventually, buffeted by a severe storm, managed to land on the eastern coast on the 25th, and the Japanese local commanders directed a ceasefire the following day. In Moscow, on the night of August 14-15, Stalin had learned that Japan had accepted the Potsdam Declaration. Apparently, in response to this, he directed the Second Far Eastern Front to occupy the northern Kuril Islands. 2/3 of the 101st Rifle Division and a couple companies of naval infantry landed near the Kataoka Naval Base on the southern shore of Shimushu, the northernmost of the Japanese islands. If you can't recognize the terrain here, you may recall that eastern Siberia for the Soviet Union has a huge peninsula sticking down to the south, and that's Kamchatka, which is in the upper right-hand corner of this map. The landing on Shimushu displayed all the errors of inexperience in amphibious operations. John would be probably embarrassed to be involved with this. The landing craft were so overloaded that they became stuck in water that was still 6 feet deep, so that the infantry had to flounder ashore, losing all but 1 radio in the process. But that night, they managed to get ashore enough anti-tank weapons that when the Japanese light tanks attacked the next day, they got shredded. Now, with a few exceptions, such as the Kuril Island operations, the Red Army had significant advantages, not just in numbers, but also in quality of heavy weapons. But the greatest Soviet advantage lay in superior doctrine and in experience in the conduct of maneuver warfare. Even in unfamiliar amphibious attacks, the Red Army and staffs displayed initiative, flexibility, and sophistication that astonishes their opponents. There remains to consider very quickly what, if anything, is the effect of this campaign on Japan's decision to surrender. I will make two brief points. First of all, that the Soviet attack closed off a major diplomatic channel. The Japanese had apparently been counting on being able to negotiate through neutral Moscow with the West about an end to the war, and this was now impossible. If anything, the Red advance was so rapid that its forward attachments outran the ability of senior Japanese officials to understand the scale and the speed of their defeat. Thank you. Up to you, sir. You good? Oh, sorry. Danke sehr.
Thanks to John and Jonathan. I've got a couple questions I'm going to ask you, and then we'll turn it over to the dream team out there for questions. But both of you kind of hit on how these kind of final operations really will form doctrine. As we see it for the Cold War, it's the strategic bombing, the use of the atomic weapon, influencing American strategic doctrine. In the sense of the Six Guards Tank Army influence in that. If you could just comment on that a little bit. It's interesting how in this phase of the war we don't really think much about how fundamentally significant these are in our strategic framework as we move into the Cold War.
I'll address the idea for atomic weapons. For the U.S. Air Force early on, it doesn't. It's just a bigger bomb. Army Air Corps strategy, or what comes U.S. Air Force strategies up into, say, 1949, the Mark III bomb is the only bomb that's in the inventory. And to quote one of the Los Alamos scientists, we had lousy bombs, unquote. And they don't look upon these as anything special. It's just a bigger boom and one airplane and one bomb. Now, when thermonuclear weapons start coming into the picture around 1949 of should we build these things, then you start seeing a reassessment of bombing strategy. If you look at some of the early atomic bombing war plans like Broiler and Off Tackle, we're flinging these bombs out there like they're nothing. The plan is to drop 104 atomic weapons on the Soviet Union in the Broiler O plan in 1948. And the question is, well, what are you dropping them on? Because you don't even have any intel of what's in those targets. Best intel you have is from captured German soldiers who are in the Soviet Union. So what you don't see early on is any subsequent change in American bombing doctrine with the use of atomic weapons. However, when fusion weapons comes around, the hydrogen bomb, which comes to fruition in 1942, now you start having the idea of the rise of the civilian strategist, Rand looking at targeting methodologies and those kinds of things. So there is a lag immediate post-war about what do these bombs really mean. And I will tell you that in 1947, that Harry Truman asked how many bombs he has in the inventory. And you know what the answer is? 0, none, because they're in pieces, because these bombs don't have a shelf life. And as a matter of fact, the guys who put the bombs together, they all went home. They had to bring these guys back to teach them how to put the bombs together, and some of their notes literally are handwritten. That's the American bombing enterprise is pretty poor. There's an obscure historian who wrote a book about it. That would be me, and it's for sale out back, shameless plug. So,
Not obscure.
So, Jonathan, how about the Soviet lesson?
I would try to suggest that this is really sort of the pièce de résistance in a long development of Soviet/Russian mechanized doctrine. And they played around with it once or twice, but in peacetime, what happened is they lose the independent spirits. You get too much supervision from, for example, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and other forces elsewhere. And if you go back and look in 2023, when the Russian army invaded Ukraine, I think you'll find, all you had to do is sort of flip my map and you'd see almost the same attempted invasion, but they no longer have the expertise to do it, not just in commanders, but particularly in logistics. The Russian army for last 150 years has been dependent on railroads, if I can grossly oversimplify, and the Ukrainians were no fools, and before the Russians came, they had already set charges to destroy all the rail crossings into Ukraine, and the Russians did not have enough trucks to do it without them.
I've got a follow-on for each of you, but that leads into the next one, because we talk about trucks, because I think one area we tend to think of Lend-Lease, if we think of it at all, influencing the European war.
Mm-hmm.
And Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union is kind of staggering. Just the trucks alone.
Something like 212,000 trucks and Jeeps. I don't remember
Yeah.
exactly, but that.
Yeah, 375,000 I think is the
Yeah.
number from the Moscow embassy. But but then it's everything else: Sherman tanks, planes, millions of tons of food. But we never think about Lend-Lease with respect to Manchuria or the war in Asia. It's kind of a dimension. And Stalin's going to say during the war that without American Lend-Lease in 42, they couldn't have continued. Khrushchev will claim that, without American Lend-Lease, the mobile campaigns of 44 and 45 would have cost more, taken longer.
Yeah, they would have had to stop more frequently and therefore, have more expensive breakthroughs over time without those trucks.
So any other thoughts, though, on, how'd the Lend-Lease get there? What were some of even the challenges on delivering that? And then, certainly the Soviets, as I've seen, have these incredible wish lists for Lend-Lease. Mm-hmm. But just some views on that.
Okay, first, very briefly, what the Soviets want, we don't have. For example, the Army Air Force is not interested in close air support. And so they don't have a lot of aircraft that will satisfy when the Soviets want something equivalent to a Sturmovik or something like that for close air support. They have to basically take our leftovers and ad hoc adjust them to do the things they want because it does not fit our doctrine. A whole history of the A-10, I think it is, but back in World War II, rather. And so, first of all, they don't have the equipment they want. While they're perfectly happy with the Sherman tank, they consider that it gets stuck in swamps, as I mentioned, far too easily. Earlier tanks that we had sent them, the shorthand reference for one particular U.S. design was a grave for 7 brothers because they thought it was a death trap, literally. Okay, so first of all, they weren't terribly happy. They suspected us of giving them our secondhand garbage. They didn't understand we had nothing else. And then, of course, they did sometimes ask for things like, how about, I think it's 6 tons of pitch blende. Anybody know what pitch blende is? It's uranium ore, I think, isn't it?
Right.
Okay. They said they needed that much for illuminated dials on watches. Anybody believe that one?
Big watches.
Okay, so they got stuff from us that maybe they shouldn't have, and sometimes we said no. Biggest problem, as you suggested, is delivering it there, and there's basically 2 ways. You send it all the way around Sweden and Norway to Murmansk, and I'm sure you've all heard the stories about the naval battles fought out there in the middle of nowhere and people freezing to death the moment they hit the water. The other route is to go through Vladivostok and go all the way across that long Trans-Siberian Railway. And that's why I suspect the Japanese did not notice the buildup of equipment to use against them because they had watched for years the stuff going by to be used against the Germans.
Yeah, one thing to bring to mind, for years in the Red Army, the term Studebaker was a term for quality.
Yeah.
And, it was kind of a synonym for quality just based on, so the trucks certainly, did that and had a huge effect on Soviet agriculture, arguably.
Sure. Same for Willys, which is the Russian version of Willys Jeep. Okay, absolutely.
And to your point, the Sturmovik, they're going to produce 35,000 of those things, and it's the most produced military aircraft in history. because we don't provide them any kind of good.
See, I told you John loves aircraft. He would,
That's right. I'm just
he would
saying.
know.
I
how
should
many- how
have,
many
I
they
should have
produce.
not opened my mouth about aircraft
That's all
types
right,
in
it's all
front of
good,
you,
my
but,
friend.
Hey, a second one, you know, Rich, you had a piece where the scientists said we shouldn't have a demonstration of the atomic weapon. And yeah, I think for some people, they'd be like, well, why was that? You know, wouldn't the scientists have argued for, you know, a demonstrated use of this? And you know, I think for some people, that's a bit of surprise. So could you unpack, you know, why would the scientists in particular argue for no demonstration? You can see why the military might, you know, in that piece, but, you know.
Yeah, a couple of reasons on that is because, as most of you know, you have Little Boy and you have Fat Man. And they're both different technologies, and they're both based on different fissionable materials. U-235 is, of course, used for Little Boy, and plutonium-239 for Fat Man. In 1945, uranium is very, very difficult to refine to become fissionable, but it's easier to have the chain reaction that you need. It's harder to make, but easier to become fissionable. Plutonium is relatively easier to make, but harder to make fissionable. So with the Little Boy bomb, you have a slug of U-235. They send it down this tube. It hits this donut of U-235, and you have a fissionable event. And the scientists, by February 1945, they've frozen the design for Little Boy. They know it will work. They don't have to test it. They know that they have a bomb in hand, but they only have enough uranium for one. Plutonium, which is going to take the bulk of the scientific effort in Los Alamos, and that lasts like 9 months of the war, you have to compress that plutonium sphere uniformly across this entire ball. At the same time, there's a polonium initiator in the middle that sends out free electrons. That's all I know about the physics. Don't ask me anything else, all right? But that's hard to do, to have this uniform implosion. That's what Trinity is all about. If that works, that means I have multiple bombs available to me. They asked Leslie Groves about doing a demonstration. He says, there's 3 reasons why you don't want to do that. One, the Japanese, as we learned last night, they're going to say it's a trick, that we don't believe that that's, and they might put some American prisoners around it, that kind of thing. 2, well, we're pretty sure it's going to work, but this is still pretty experimental, and if it doesn't work, we're going to look stupid, okay? But the third and more important reason was, if we light this off, I don't have that bomb anymore because I don't know about implosion. I don't know if that will work. And the plan all along is from 1944, from the Military Policy Committee, determined you're going to need multiple weapons to have an effect on the Japanese. So when you look at the logistics of what I'll call a stockpile, and I told you we don't have one, it's very few. So when you have the implosion device, now at least I have 2 bombs that I can use. There is a 3rd core that is actually made. It doesn't go forward, but there's a 3rd core that they have ready to use if they need it. So this idea of a demonstration actually reduces what would be, say, the deterrent effect of the atomic weapons had you used them later on. That's what's important about Trinity. Now I have multiple weapons.
So with that, let's open it up to the audience here.
Let's have a round of applause for our panelists, please.
Good.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to go with the first question all the way to your right, about halfway back.
Once silver plate got to Tinian, what was the coordination and relationship between LeMay and Tibbets, and how long ahead of time did LeMay know what was coming?
Great question. Yeah, LeMay's read in on Manhattan. He's one of the few guys in 21st Bomber Command who is read in. Most are not. Even within the 509th itself, Tibbets is read in, and I think his 3 is read in, but nobody else is read in. They're kind of, we're doing these mission profiles. We're dropping the pumpkin practice bombs with our silver plate bombers. the Enola Gay and the planes that are in the 509th are not your regular B-29s. These are like the hot rods of B-29s. They have fuel-injected engines. They have a completely different structured bomb bay, so you can put the Fat Man and Little Boy in the thing. They take all the defensive armament out to lighten the load. Why? Because these bombs weigh about 10 tons, which is at the structural limit of your B-29. And if you read accounts of Tibbets, at Able Runway, he says, and I quote, "I used every inch of runway to get airborne because a normal load is like 150,000 pounds for a B-29. No, 110, he's at 150. So the silver plates have that extra oomph and horsepower in them so you can get off the ground and, more importantly, egress, get out of the way. And one of the things that they're doing to practice that with these pumpkin bombs is they will actually bomb, I think it's 51 different enemy targets in the Pacific, where they will drop this pumpkin bomb that is simulating a Fat Man. And what they do is a 155-degree, 60-degree angle of bank turn to get the hell out of the way. And it will put them 6 to 8 miles away from the point of impact. Now you think a B-29 has a wingspan of about 103 feet, correct me if I'm wrong. That's a big airplane to be doing basically a fighter maneuver. Now, the 509th, when they show up at Tinian, they're special. And if anybody here who's been in the military, nobody likes special units because they get everything they want. And the 509th is all off to themselves, and they get everything they want, but nobody knows what they're doing. So there's a lot of tension between the 509th and the rest of the bombers and the bomb wings that are there on Tinian. And Tibbets and LeMay don't like each other because LeMay has to provide all the logistic support to the 509th because they have priority. I was told the story years later. The two men met up at Maxwell Air Force Base for a gathering of eagles. They passed each other, said hello, and said nothing else to each other. I hope that answers your question, sir.
Next question is going to be to your right in the back, please.
Thanks. So my question is, sometimes people argue that Soviet entry in the war becomes really important for Japanese decision-making. And sometimes it seems like people are sort of implicitly suggesting that there could be Soviets fighting on the Japanese home islands. I've always just been a little skeptical of that argument. Is there any chance that had things gone on longer, we would have seen Soviet forces fighting in meaningful numbers in an invasion of Japan?
As I believe I mentioned, Stalin planned, and I think may even have attempted one assault, but I can't be sure about this, to invade the northern island. I don't think he was really up to it because, as I said, they were sort of improvising the whole idea of amphib operations. But had the war not ended when it did, they would certainly have tried to invade the northernmost of the main islands. So yeah, there would have been definitely force on force.
Next, we're going to go to your left in the very back row with Connie, please.
Yes, I wanted to ask, between the first and second atomic bomb, what was the communication?
Can you put the microphone to your mouth, please, sir?
What was the communication between Japan and the United States after the first bomb was dropped?
Yeah.
And were there any additional bombing runs between the two?
They're continuing. LeMay is continuing with this bombing campaign. As a matter of fact, even after the second bomb is dropped, there are still conventional missions that are flown over Japan during that time because we don't have a response. And one of the things you have to, when you talk about the Japanese, they got to figure out what the hell happened. This is not in the internet days where you just kind of go online and find out what happened. They got to do this. What was this thing? What happened? And how do we react to this kind of thing? But there are still conventional operations going on because we don't know if the war is over or not.
Yeah, to add to that, isn't tell me, it may not be accurate, but as I believe, Kokura is supposed to be the target on the 9th.
Yes.
But it's obscured, and it's obscured partially by our own bombing, but also by the weather.
That's right.
And so, there's other raids going on, and of course then they'll divert to Nagasaki before they run out of fuel. So it looks like a pretty active threat environment, if you will. during this period.
As a matter of fact, I think, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you looked at this, there's some missions flown near the end of August over Japan that are actually attacked, some B-32 Dominators, where some Air Force crewmen are actually killed
Yep.
by Japanese fighters who intercept them. And this is after the announcement.
Yeah, so one thing that's interesting is Jonathan brought up, the ceasefire with the Soviets is not until the 25th of August. The Japanese ceasefire is done in phases. And so then even though the home islands are supposed to be 2 days later after the 16th, so the 18th, the recon flights, one's attacked by 21 aircraft that'll come up, seriously wound several of the airmen. One's going to die on the way back to Okinawa, and he'll be probably the last American airman who's killed in combat. And then in the operations to provide for the POWs, another 77 airmen will die in those. Likely, from my view, it's probably from B-29s that catch fire and have to ditch somewhere. It's not the most reliable aircraft, I think, in that piece.
So there's still some conventional operations going on, even though we've dropped these munitions.
Gentlemen, all the way in the back row, center aisle, please.
Yeah, my question is regarding the way the war ended and the effect it had on the U.S. Army. As I understand it, the atomic bomb pretty much made the Army a service in search of a mission.
Yeah.
And in the afterglow of victory, nobody was really asking, is the George Marshall recipe for success, which was so successful during the war, is that going to work in a post-World War II world?
That's a great question. And there's another obscure historian who wrote a book about that too. It's also out there for sale. I just throw that out there.
But you have to hurry up and sign them.
Yeah, but to your point, there's a naval historian, strategist by the name of Bernard Brodie, who writes a book in 1946 called The Ultimate Weapon. He's talking about atomic weapons. And his famous quote is, "Now the mission of militaries is to avoid war, not to conduct war." And so the question is, what are militaries used for now because of this destruction? And this is before we know about thermonuclear weapons, where you're talking megatons worth of destruction as opposed to kilotons. And what you have, there is a huge intramural food fight between the services subsequent to the war over roles and missions. And the biggest fight is between the Navy and the Air Force, because the Navy traditionally had been the strategic reach of our nation. Airplanes, weren't around, but now I can go intercontinental, and so you see this food fight between the two services. Matter of fact, there's a great quote of an Air Force officer. He goes to the officers club at NAS Oceana in Virginia, and he tells them, whether you like it or not, all your cares are going to be sunken in the bottom of the ocean, and we don't care if you like it. We're the dominant force now, and we're in charge. And he says that to a room full of naval officers. Imagine how well that went over, Mr. Simons.
Oh, yeah, there was a huge scandal in connection with that when the Navy wanted to reinforce their flight decks so they could presumably carry an aircraft that could manage to carry a small bomb. And that there were resignations and all kinds of heartburn about it.
And the plane they designed is designed to build the little boy, to carry the little boy bomb. And guess what? There's no little boy bombs in the inventory. We don't make any more, but that's the nature of military procurement, I guess. So, anyway.
Gents, we're going to stay in the center aisle, a little to your right, please.
Yeah, sort of a counterfactual to pressure test the non-decision thesis, which is really persuasive. And it really centers on the variable of Harry Truman. If Franklin Roosevelt had been alive in August of 1945, or Henry Wallace had been the president, and in the FDR's case, deeply influenced by the personality of Admiral Leahy, who was deeply opposed to the use of the bomb, would the outcome have been the same?
Yeah, it's a great counterfactual. And this is my opinion, so you're free to disagree. Think about it, FDR is the one who approved Manhattan anyway, years before. So this is under his auspices, under his authorization, and his budget, as dark as it may be, because it's dark money. And I would add to that the same rationales for Truman. And one more note that I didn't mention in my presentation. If the primary purpose of a government is to safeguard the people and the nation itself, I think the chief executive has that responsibility, and in 1945, I think that would be his overriding principle. Again, we can disagree on that, but I don't think the outcome would have been different. That's my opinion on it. We can certainly disagree.
We're going to go in the front, in the center aisle, please.
With the Russians in Manchuria, and Stalin typically, once he had land, didn't like to give it up, how long did they stay and why did they get out?
Well, in large numbers, they stayed about 4 years, about the same time as by 48, 49. The two U.S. corps that I mentioned had withered away simply by the point system, and they were withdrawn. But yeah, they stayed in the late 40s, which it's not a coincidence that Mao Zedong had sent his agents into Manchuria to sort of reestablish that as a red province, because before that the nationalists had controlled it pretty well. And so you can argue that the Reds facilitate, but they're not open and blatant about it, but they facilitate the communist setting up again. Now, fast forward to 1950, when the U.S. is coming up to the Yalu River, and there's a lot of misinterpretation about what happened there, but one of the things Mao demanded from Stalin and got was Soviet fighter squadrons with experienced World War II fighter pilots in Manchuria to sort of back him up before he went into North Korea. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
We're going to go to your left with Connie, please.
John, this is a question for you. Can you talk to us about the Americans dropping leaflets on the cities before they were bombed, and then what was the response of the Japanese civilians to those leaflets?
Yeah, matter of fact, as Mr. Partial, or not, but James mentioned earlier, during the firebombing campaign, they're already leaving the cities. They're already, even with the firebombing. Then we do drop leaflets in between to say, hey, go ask what happened in Hiroshima. Go check that out. You know, we do drop warning leaflets to them, but there already is this diaspora from these urban centers to kind of get out of the way. And that comes largely from the firebombing, you know, not necessarily from the atomic weapons, but we do drop those things. And there are some people, of course, who heed them. And there's one unfortunate individual who leaves Hiroshima to go to Nagasaki. Yeah, there's a book out. It's a fascinating discussion on that. But we do that. But the Japanese are already leaving their cities for very good reasons because of the firebombing campaign.
And food, I presume.
And that too.
Dr. House, I'm going to take MC's prerogative. You had referenced the answer about territory. Can you tell us about people? What was the story of the Japanese who were captured by the Red Army?
That's really, it's part of the larger question of what happens to all the Japanese, both military and civilian, who are in China. And for a while there, I think there were people paying some of these Japanese to basically be mercenaries against the communists. But by the later 40s, they finally got evacuated home. Obviously, not everything went well. There must have been some people who suffered. But they had enough weapons, enough force that I don't think they could have been treated the way the refugees were in, say, Eastern Europe, the German refugees.
Thank you for that, and I think it's actually a great segue into our final session of the day that we're going to have. But thank you to Jonathan House, John Curatola, and Mike Bell. I do want to draw your attention to a few things. One is that we do a lot of these programs. I'll tell you about one of them at the end of the day today, but we have our flyers out that sort of promote the Institute, but more importantly, it tells you what we do, and it'll have a QR code that'll take you to our website. It'll also then take you to our articles that our team and our curators and our educators also contribute to, our videos, shorts that you've been seeing playing during the interstitials. I strongly encourage you to do that if you're aware of it. Hopefully you can talk it up in the hallway. And if you're not aware of it, I think you're going to get hooked because we're all World War II nerds. Our panelists will be outside for book signing. You know the drill by now. We're going to have a 30-minute break, and we will be back at, I believe, 3:15, if my math is correct. So we will be at 3:15. I would like one final round of applause. What you all don't know, while we were enjoying lunch, Mike was being interrogated by thousands of callers on C-SPAN. He was in during the lunch break, and he was patched in with those that were being patched through D.C. and answering as many questions as he could. So he needs to go get his lunch break now. But thank you, gentlemen, and thank you all. We'll see you for our final session in 30 minutes.